So Brian Reilly, he's a security engineer and researcher, a very skilled exploit developer. He's got a lot of operational time on keyboard, and he's here to talk about a few CVEs that he discovered and has credit for. And so he's going to do a deep dive into one of the Adobe products. If you're a red teamer, you can't avoid Adobe products. They are, in every big enterprise. Some of them better than others. I know AEM is a gift that keeps on giving. He's talked at a lot of different conferences, SummerCon, B-Sides, LV. We're lucky to have him here, and so without further ado, thank you, Brian.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, this is Control the Variables, and you can control the code. I am really excited to be here, and we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. Quick, a little bit about me. In my day job, I lead a small security team at a tech company in the entertainment space. Independent of that, I do some independent research and private consulting. Everything I'm talking about is the result of that independent work. I've been in the industry for about 25 years. I've spent a lot of my career focused on AppSec and offense, but I've also spent a considerable amount of time doing defensive security, response, and I started out my career in higher education and supporting state and local government. I understand a lot of the challenges and obstacles there, so if anyone here works in those verticals, I'd love to chat after this. And then more recently, most of my experience has been in tech and financial services. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? So just quick show of hands. Who has heard of ColdFusion, used ColdFusion, tested ColdFusion? All right, great, wonderful. And in case you're in the group who hasn't heard of it, we're really going to touch really briefly on some tech internals. Then we're going to just dive right into a couple of techniques and a couple of vulnerabilities that will let you control how variables are obtained, control functions, and basically do some cool stuff. That being said, this is a pretty narrow talk, and so the attack surface of ColdFusion is huge. We're really only touching a tiny sliver of it today. All right, so if you're not familiar with ColdFusion, it is a web development platform. It's over 30 years old, definitely has a little bit of a legacy, varnish or legacy reputation. A couple of significant milestones. In 2002, it was rewritten in Java. Previously, it was all C and C++. And then in 2005, Adobe acquired it from Alair, and it is still an Adobe product today. Outside of Adobe ColdFusion, there are a couple of other CFML engines, most notably the open source project Lucy. There's also a couple of now defunct products and projects, including Reilly, Blue Dragon, and OpenBD. But all we're talking about today is Adobe ColdFusion. All right, so if you haven't seen ColdFusion, ColdFusion can either be tag-based or script-based. Tag-based looks very similar to HTML, except it's run server-side. Script-based looks almost like any other scripting language. When this code is compiled, it's compiled into Java class files, and Java being Java, it is also very easy to go from your class file back to a decompiled representation of what that native Java source code would look like. And these class files are what are actually run by the ColdFusion engine when your code runs. All right. ColdFusion also has the concept of scopes, where if you're not familiar with that, you can think of it as like the context or the bucket that your variables live. So you have some scopes like the URL scope, and that's where all your URL parameters and values get stored. Form scope stores your form data. Cookie scope stores the cookie data. Those are all going to be scopes that are going to be tainted, untrusted, user-controlled values. So I change my cookies, it changes the data in the cookie scope. That being said, there's other scopes, such as the application scope, where you can store static application global variables. And so some scopes like that, or the server scope, those are values that would be trusted, that absent some other vulnerability, a user should never be able to directly control. And so when functionality is built, those are considered trusted sources of data. The other scope that I'll point out here is the argument scope. This stores the function arguments, and just remember that one for later. Okay. Variables in ColdFusion can also be unscoped, and if they are, the application engine looks for that variable in a cascading series of scopes, and here's how that would work out. So first it looks in local, then it checks the argument scope, so on and so forth, all the way down. The cookie scope and then the client scope would be the last ones that are searched. This is a kind of contrived code, but for a long time the idea of scope injection was a well-known ColdFusion vulnerability. If, for example, your code did something like check for an is-admin true or false, if that hadn't been set in your code, a user could come in and set is-admin equals true in the URL. That would be found when the code searched for some admin, some variable named is-admin in any of the scopes. And then since then, most recently in 2024, Adobe has released a patch where now searching for implicit variables, or I'm sorry, searching for unscoped variables is turned off by default. Let's talk a little bit about ColdFusion functions. So like any other language, ColdFusion has functions. One of the attributes of a function is the access parameter, and what that controls how the function can be called. So if a function is a private, a package, or a public function, that means that server-side code needs to call it. A user can't directly interact with it unless the page or the application they're dealing with calls that function. If it's a remote function, they can call it via a URL, very similar to an API endpoint or REST API or anything that you can hit with a URL. It's also worth calling out that the code paths that if you're calling a page or a function are different, and a default ColdFusion install comes with lots and lots of remote CFCs. We look at some examples of these. So here we have a remote function, access type is remote, and we can call something like this in a URL. We specify the function name, the method name, and then we pass it our variables. So here we pass it foo and bar, and it prints out foo bar, all done through a URL. And this could be passed in through form data or any other user source too, but again, called via a URL. In addition, besides calling function arguments individually from a URL, there's also a special variable called argument collection that can contain all the variables passed to a single function. This can be passed in as either a JSON object or a WDDX packet, which is an XML-like data structure. And so here, instead of individually passing in foo and bar, we pass it in one single JSON object, for example. Remote functions can be dangerous. There have been historical XXZ vulnerabilities. There have been a lot of Java deserialization vulnerabilities in ColdFusion that are all reachable through any single remote CFC function. There doesn't have to be a vulnerability in the function itself. It's just I can reach vulnerable code that way. And we're not going to talk about those today, but the first thing we're going to touch on is the idea of mass assignment. So a vulnerability where a requesting user can set variables, can set values for things that they shouldn't be able to set, and if those values are used in security contexts. So let's say the variable controls your sign-in or your authenticated state or stuff to do with encryption or sessions, or can I do this, can I access this? There can be big impact. And this is not a vulnerability type unique to ColdFusion. If you're not familiar with mass assignment, there have been mass assignment vulnerabilities in ASP.NET, in PHP, in Node, and lots of other programming languages. All right, so let's look at this example. Again, kind of contrived, but it's a remote function that checks is our environment. So it's checking application.env, and if that equals dev, if we're in our dev environment, then something's going to happen. Maybe I can get access to a resource, maybe it's going to print out debug info, but this would be like a check in the code saying, hey, where are we running? Should we do this to the user? Should we take this code path or the other? As it turns out, if you passed in your argument collection with one of those variables set, this function would retrieve app.env, not from the application code, not from that safe application storage, but it would obtain it from the user-supplied argument collection. This was fixed in November of 2023, and then a couple months later, some of the researchers found a bypass for this. It's been fixed as well. More recently, I was doing some manual testing and code review and stumbled upon something that was kind of interesting. So one of the admin API endpoints is for a method called getBuildNumber. Again, not high risk, not particularly sexy or security related. It retrieves the server.coldfusion.product version value and prints it out. So it says, hey, we're running version ColdFusion 2023 patch release 1 or whatever. And just through some dumb fuzzing, I passed in my own server.coldfusion.product version, and what I provided was echoed back to me. And that was really, really strange because like this shouldn't be scope injection, this shouldn't be vulnerable. I'd never seen anything like this. And then I dug into the code, and this is a partial decompilation of the endpoint itself, and we're saying, yep, all we're doing is trying to resolve that one particular value. But then when I looked at how the actual resolution happens, it was kind of interesting because there were two different code paths, and if the variable was two levels, so if it was like application.product version, if it was two levels, it just looked, hey, I'm going to look in the application scope, bang, end of story. If it was three levels or more, so foo.bar.baz, like then totally different code path would split it up on those dots, and then there was a totally different process where you can see the function name is called resolve split names. And then from here, it takes that, it looks, again, kind of following that scope search order where the first scope that it searches in is the argument scope, which again makes sense because we're passing in that server.coldfusion.product number in the URL. It's going to a function, so it's going from our URL scope to our argument scope. And then when it's actually doing the resolution, it's looking for that in the argument scope first, finding it, and then we've effectively changed that value. And so this vulnerability lets us control values that are 3 levels or more. And so while server.coldfusion.product version may not be particularly interesting or security related, think of if it's something related to the user's role or something session related or something security related. And so depending on functionality, we may be able to break assumptions there. This vulnerability was fixed in August of 2025. And what they did was strictly type the functions. So all of the function arguments must be explicitly defined. So you can't slip in variables in there. And this was a breaking change and broke a lot of code out there that was maybe expecting dynamic arguments or not predefined variables into the function. Looking at one example of a blind SSRF vulnerability in ColdFusion itself that was vulnerable because of this. This, again, not particularly high impact, but is a good illustration of, yes, these vulnerabilities really do exist. This check file exists method is something within the ColdFusion administrator, and like when you're downloading patches and updates, it's going to download something, check to see, hey, does it exist? And it's relying on this application.updateSettings.download home path, which is set in a server-side configuration file. But using this technique, we can pass in our own path for that. And so since we can control that variable, it's used in the call. And instead of using the hard set server settings, it's using the value that we put in. So we can put in a URL or a file path, and it will go ahead and fetch that. And this vulnerability was patched at the same time as the larger one back in August of 2025. However, it's more than just remote functions. I was looking at ColdFusion documentation, and one of the things they talked about was even for your local functions or your public functions or your private functions, you can pass in some entire user-controlled struct as your argument collection. What could go wrong there? So here we have a public function but we're getting our argument collection from the user-controlled form scope. So if we look at an example like this, again, contrived example, but we're printing out hey to whatever the name we put in, and then just to show that yes, we can control sensitive values, we're printing out the server.os name. So we run this without tampering. It prints out our expected OS version and our hello message. But if we pass in our user-controlled value into this method, where again, not a remote function, not a remote method, that's the value that gets retrieved and used for this function call. This vulnerability was patched back in December, and it changed the default searching and scope resolution process, and also added some reserved words where basically the names of the built-in scopes couldn't be used as function arguments anymore. And again, another breaking change, because if you relied on that, you'd have to refactor your code. All right, so quick two-step process. If you have applications that may be impacted by this, or if you're testing an application that may be tested by this, as you look at your functions, is it a remote function? Time for code review, time for refactoring, lots of vulnerabilities, huge attack surface across remote functions. If it's not a remote function, look to see, does it get an argument collection value from a user-controlled value? If it does, dive into the code, think about refactoring. And if you're in a good position of, no, I'm not doing either one of these things, look at the entire rest of your application stack and attack surface. Okay, wrapping it up, just by looking at all the pieces here, our entire attack surface is pretty broad. ColdFusion is a complex application that has a lot of Java components, the idea of scopes and variables, and just lots of pieces coming together. These vulnerabilities let you control values that you shouldn't be able to control, and the specific impact is, again, going to depend on the actual vulnerable functionality and the application functionality. And then really just security 101, this is another great example of user input is untrusted, user input can be dangerous. So if we have strict user input validation, maybe we detect this even before someone would be able to slip this in. If we were expecting our URLs or our parameters to look a certain way, we can filter out some of this stuff. And kind of bottom line, if you're looking at this from like an offensive or a testing perspective, this is probably a vulnerability that you're going to need source code to find. You may be able to get lucky with a little bit of fuzzing, looking at like default application scopes and variable scope names, just to see, hey, like when I send this in, do I get an error message indicating that something could be here? But yeah, so that's really it. Here's my contact info, Twitter, Blue Sky, slides will be online at some point in the future. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. I can walk around the room here. It's now time for questions. I'm going to kick things off with one question in the beginning. Your research that you've done, you've uncovered that there's some flaws with the language itself. So my question is,
I think the Adobe team put a lot of effort into it, but I'd say kind of at a bare minimum, that's definitely a platform where you want your environment to always be on the latest patch release. So like there's lots of vulnerabilities. Some of the vulnerabilities, like you've said, have extremely long tails where there's headlines for like 10-year-old vulnerabilities used in ransomware campaigns today. 15-year-old vulnerabilities still out there, still on the internet, and that's kind of the rub of a legacy system, where it's out there, it may be forgotten, it may not be patched, but it still may be critical. And if it's on there, having a critical 15-year-old vulnerability at some point may ruin your day if it turns into a ransomware issue.
Definitely, and a lot of potentially in the future. Awesome.
Great question.
Any other questions from the crowd? We got one in the middle here. Please speak into the mic.
When you were doing this research, did you do any sort of end-to-end analysis that made you target scoping in general, or was it more reading documentation, or just that's what you picked?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. So when you focus specifically on scoping within ColdFusion, is there any reason you focused on scoping? Was there any sort of end-day analysis and previous bugs, or just something you thought was interesting?
Not really. Like I said, before the first mass assignment vulnerability that I found, the only other scope-related vulnerability I was aware of was like the idea of scope injection. So like the is admin true false kind of thing. Really, it was like a lot of manual testing, a lot of like just looking at decompiled code and saying, hey, you know what? Like there's complex stuff here, and it really was an iterative process where like I found some stuff, I thought it was fixed, I found some more stuff, and really just like unwinding pretty deep code paths throughout the engine.
We've got time for one more question. If somebody asks a question, then you don't have to hear me talk. All right, I guess, hey, we got a question right here.
So when you're looking for scope injection, you said it's probably going to be, yeah. So when you're hunting for scope injection, you said it's probably going to be one of those vulnerabilities you do source code review for. So your process for doing a source code review in this case would be look for all of those remote functions, see if there's any essentially variables or classes that are scoped remotely, and then go and try to set any values that may have like security related ramifications. Is that kind of the process that you're
Yeah, that would be that, and that was kind of what I was trying to get through with the blind SSRF example. So like look at all the cases where your functions are resolving variables, and then at least for the more recent vulnerabilities, if they're 3 or more levels deep, those are things that I can control, and then kind of based on the context of the application, what happens if I change the value of this variable? So like certainly in more sensitive actions and looking at some public code out there, like if those variables control encryption. So like if I can change a key used for encrypting or decrypting, and then I can also control the ciphertext, I may be able to subvert application flow and lead to something high impact. Okay. But yeah, you definitely, in terms of methodology, yeah, like look at where variables are used, and then what happens if something that's assumed to be trusted can be modified by the user.
All right, since someone made the mistake of giving me a microphone, I have one little soapbox. Brian has done some incredible research on software that lives in dark pockets all over the world. This is not the only legacy system that is inherently vulnerable, that has had multiple code base changes. So these exist and they run like our entire world. Brian, I don't know what his research team is like. Maybe this is the research team?
This is the research team.
Their entire intelligence organization, some of you may have some familiarity, that dig into these old legacy products that still have support contracts today because the people who have them, they have data that's very valuable. And so there's teams looking into this type of stuff all the time because there's gold. There's 10-year-old bugs, and if you can find a path to that code execution, then the world's your oyster. So if you're on defense, patch management, it's mandatory. It's not optional. You have to stay on top of it. In my personal experience, Adobe doesn't make it easy. And then on top of that, if you're an attacker and you do have a vulnerability research team, you want to go after those legacy systems first because you need to put up as many mitigations as possible outside of their recommendation, WAFs, things like that. So that's the end of my soapbox, Brian. Thank you so much for your research.
Thank you.
That's a gift to the community. Thank you. And thanks for the talk.
Huh?